What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another datasheet deep dive, the Warhammer 40k video series where we take one datasheet in the game and analyze it in excruciating detail. And we are going back to our roots here today with this episode of the show because we are going to be doing a good old-fashioned weapon loadout comparison for one of the most competitive models that you will definitely see gracing the tables of tournament Warhammer 40k, the Warlord Titan. Warlord Titans are massive, striding war machines that dominate the battlefields of the 41st millennium. They come in at a measly, affordable 3,500 points, a walking army in and of themselves. And all that being said, they are just too big to play in a standard game of Strike Force 40k, but it is still fun to talk about. So what we are going to be doing today is breaking down this datasheet, talking about its expected damage against a variety of targets and the best weapons that you can equip your Warlord Titan with. You know, the one that you definitely have and will certainly play with. So sit back, relax, click like on the video, and let's talk about Warlord Titans.
But first, sponsor time.
It's good that we're talking about weapon math today because this video is sponsored by Adept Roll. Are you tired of guessing whether or not your 40k game plan will pay off? I'm happy to introduce Adept Roll, a dice probability calculator usable on basically any mobile device. For those who haven't used these tools before, they offer a very simple plug-in system where you can input your weapon stats versus defending stats and calculate the probabilities of certain dice results or the average amount of damage that you should expect from a particular attack sequence. Adept Roll is a mobile app designed to give you precise calculations on probabilities for these attacks. It saves you the time and effort of doing the complex math and allows you to focus more heavily on actually outplaying your opponent on the battlefield. I myself use these tools quite often in my games of 40k, especially if I'm identifying two lines of play.
Curious what the math hammer is. According to this, the average damage is 3.
Adept Roll also features profile imports from both Rosterizer and New Recruit, allowing you to import your unit and attack profiles quicker and easier for faster calculations on the fly. So take control of your 40k battles with more powerful dice insight and download Adept Roll for free on iOS or Android by following the links down in the video description. Now, getting into the top line profile of these things, I would say here that this is a standard Titan profile or something like that, but in this case, the Warlord Titan is exceptionally non-standard. This is probably one of, if not the most impressive top line profiles in all of 40k, which befits the most expensive model in all of 40k. The Warlord Titan comes with a fairly standard movement of 10, bringing it in line with a lot of other leggy boys in the game. Things like Imperial Knights are going to be a similar level of maneuverability to this guy. That said, he is much more difficult to kill, including a toughness value of 16, the highest, at least as far as I know, toughness in the entire game. The only unit that, without any attack modifiers, Magnus the Red does not infect wound on 2s. What a claim to fame. That is also backed up by an impressive 2+ save, and given the physical mass of this thing, it is almost always guaranteed to be in cover, basically permanently forever, as long as its pinky toe is hiding behind a grain of sand that is improved to a 1+ armor save against ranged attacks. And that's backed up even if you're being shot at by huge anti-Titan weaponry on the other side by a 5+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks as well. It does have a relatively mediocre leadership of 6, and will become battle shocked occasionally, especially if you have a tough time punching through its ridiculous wounds count. It also has ways to battle shock itself, which we'll discuss in a moment. However, all those defensive mechanics are backing up an insane wounds characteristic of 100. The big 3 digits. On top of that, it's also OC30. You need 15 OC2 models to contest an objective it's touching. 16 if you actually want to take the objective away. That's easy. Yeah, this thing basically trash at holding objectives. Now, Now, within the context of the Adeptus Titanicus faction, the Warlord Titan actually gets no benefit. We can basically skip the entire synergies section of this video that we would normally do for a regular unit because there essentially are no synergies inside the faction. In fact, the army ability it gets out of the Adeptus Titanicus index is essentially the ability to actually play it. It doesn't have any detachment, and Adeptus Titanicus have no characters, but the Towering Example ability allows you to, if you are playing Adeptus Titanicus, choose a Titanicus unit to be your warlord, and you can also ignore the select detachment rules step, which is normally required to build a Warhammer 40k army. First, you select your faction keyword, then your detachment, and then build the rest of your army from there. Not having a detachment, the Adeptus Titanicus army rule is basically that. You don't get any rules, just be fine with your ridiculous number of insane guns. Interestingly, you don't have to choose the Warlord Titan to be your warlord. You could have a non-warlord warlord, and your warlord could not be a warlord. In case you ever want to choose your Warhound Titan, if you are playing a 4,800 point game of 40k, and you got 2 Titans, you could make the Warlord Titan not the Warlord Titan. You could make a different Titan, the Warlord Titan, that's separate from the Warlord Titan. Or you could make a Warlord Titan if you wanted to. However, once we go back to the front of the Warlord Titan's datasheet, this being the Warlord Titan model, not a Titan selected to be the army's warlord, it does have a different faction ability under its abilities section. Now, this datasheet is perfectly balanced and has been the result of unending hours of design time. I'm sure the development team over in the 40k studio has pored over the Adeptus Titanicus index to ensure the competitive viability and rules legibility of this 3,500 point super heavy walker. Speaking of that, it has the super heavy walker faction ability. Not Towering Example. This is the faction ability of Imperial Knights that allows them to move over non-Titanic other models as well as small terrain features, and even move through large terrain features at the chance of battle shocking themselves. Now, I'm not sure how this works, but I think the intention is that the Warlord Titan adopts the super heavy walker ability from Imperial Knights. This is a little weird because many abilities in Warhammer 40k are similarly named, but do different things on different datasheets or in different factions, and this ability is not described anywhere inside the Titanicus index itself. However, it does improve the maneuverability of its 10-inch movement quite a bit, if that is how it's supposed to work, which I think is fairly safe to assume. Now, if you wanted to take a Warlord Titan in a different faction, you could do so thanks to the Titanic Support and Titanicus Tortoise abilities. Titanic Support allows you to slot in an Adeptus Titanicus model into a different army with the Imperium keyword. You can also do the same for Chaos factions using the Titanicus Tortoise ability, which just replaces references to Imperium with Chaos, allowing you to ally it into Chaos army. So if you are playing a game of greater than 3,500 points, you could put a Warlord Titan into an army of a different faction, and just in case you felt like you needed a little bit of extra to help you meet the agreed points value of. Now, on top of that, the Warlord Titan also has some special abilities of its own. These include Striding Colossus, a pure debuff that makes it much harder to use stratagems on him. In fact, quadrupling the CP cost of those stratagems, making basically any stratagem that is capable of targeting the Warlord Titan at least 4 command points. Now, unfortunately for this Titan, as we just mentioned, it does not have a detachment, so it has no stratagems available for use outside of core stratagems. So you can use things like Command Reroll, Insane Bravery, and Tank Shock on the Warlord Titan. Whether you would want to, with it costing 4 command points, probably not. But maybe you have a lot of command points in a 4,000 point game of 40k. I actually don't know, and I don't know how those work. On top of that, it also inflicts the wrath of the Omnissiah upon its foes. This is the pièce de résistance of the Warlord Titan's datasheet. This is the payoff for paying 3,500 points and the cost of a mid-size sedan to include this massive towering war machine on your table. After it fires its weapons in the shooting phase, you can select an enemy hit by 1 or more of its attacks, and that unit must take a battle shock test. That's it. That's all we got. It's not automatically battle shocked. It's only one unit, and the Warlord Titan does have many guns. But generally speaking, the power of these guns are such that when it points them at you, you die almost regardless of what your defensive profile is. So having a model survive is basically more impressive than passing a subsequent battle shock check. In fact, I think that a unit that survives the attacks of a Warlord Titan should get some sort of bonus for the remainder of the game instead of malus of potentially failing a battle shock test, given the fact that it just survived 3,500 points of concentrated death. On top of that, this is also a out-of-phase battle shock effect, so if you fail that battle shock test, you are battle shocked for the remainder of the Warlord Titan's turn. You can't use stratagems, your OC becomes 0, which can be useful for objectives sometimes, but when it comes back to your own turn, if you are not subsequently murdered by the remainder of the Imperium army, you then immediately unbattle shock, although you're likely to be below half strength because a Warlord Titan just shot at you. This is very rarely a highly impactful ability. It is useful in very specific circumstances, but generally speaking, not something you go out of your way to include, and certainly not worth 3,500 points. Why it was decided that the Warlord Titan is the best place for this ability confounds me, but as we'll talk about later on, there are some confounding choices made on this datasheet, this only being the first one of them. Last and certainly not least, on the Titan's datasheet, it also has the Deadly Demise ability for 2d6 plus 6 damage, which is quite a few mortal wounds, although we have to remember that it is only 6 inches away from the Warlord Titan. So he kind of implodes rather than explodes if he deadly demises. If you're standing directly adjacent to the Titan, you may be affected and you'll probably die, even though the plasma reactors in the heart of a Warlord Titan are capable of annihilating cities when they go critical. It still only affects you 6 inches away, which, you know, it's totally fine. Now, in addition, it also has some very relevant keywords. It is, of course, a vehicle and an Imperium unit, but it's also a walker, which allows it to do things like heroically intervene. That's very cool. Lastly, it's also towering, so if it touches terrain, or at least ruins, it is able to draw line of sight through those using true line of sight. And given that the Warlord Titan is enormous, it will probably be getting line of sight to a lot of stuff that is not hiding behind its own ruin. Interestingly, this also, I think, gives the Warlord Titan maybe one of the best opportunities to ignore cover out of anybody in the game, because the chances that the Warlord Titan can draw line of sight from the top of its big, outstretched carapace weapons to enemies that are then not obstructed by intervening terrain features, they may not get cover. The Warlord Titan might be able to ignore it, but generally speaking, we are going to assume that the targets of the Titan, as we move further in this video, are benefiting from cover, because this being 10th edition, that's just a generally safe assumption. The Warlord Titan can also be damaged once it is reduced below 1/3 of its health. At 33 or lower wounds remaining, it subtracts 1 from its hit rolls when attacking, and it also subtracts 15 from its objective control characteristic, bringing it down to 15. Interestingly, it has no way to ignore other modifiers, so if it is engaged and firing out of melee, for example, it is still going to be -1 to hit anyway, and I think there are going to be a lot of situations in which this thing will be getting engaged by enemies in order to impose that -1 to hit, which can be pretty effective since it has no access to things like rerolls. Now, what weapons are we getting those hit penalties with? Looking at the back of the datasheet, we can talk about the Titan's weapon loadout. The Warlord has 2 options for carapace-mounted weapons, either Apocalypse launchers or laser blasters. It also has 4 defensive weapons. These are always, there's no options here, 2 Ardex Defensor Maulers, which are an interesting anti-medium infantry sweeper. 6 shots apiece at strength 6 AP2 for 2 damage. We'll kill a couple Space Marines with those guys for a total of 12 shots because there are 2 of them. It also has 2 Ardex Defensor las cannons, which are just las cannons. It's just regular las cannon. Last, and certainly not least, in fact, the biggest part of the Warlord Titan are its arm-mounted weapon systems. It has 5 separate options for arm systems, these being the Ariok Power Claw, the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon, Macro Gatling Blaster, Morai Quake Cannon, and Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator. It can choose one of these for each of its arm slots, and can even duplicate these weapons if it so desires. First off, I'm gonna get something out of the way real quick, the Ariok Power Claw. The majority of this video is going to be a comparison of the ranged weapon systems of the Warlord Titan, so I'm not really going to talk about the Power Claw. On top of that, I think the Power Claw is kind of bad. It does have a staggeringly powerful melee profile, especially on its strike. I think this might be the highest damage weapon in the game, but don't quote me on that. It hits at strength 20 AP4 for 24 damage with 6 base attacks. The downside here is that it has a 4+ weapon skill. So if we think through the math momentarily, it probably gets 3 hits and 2 wounds on most heavy targets that are toughness 11+, which is most of the things you're going to be punching with this power claw anyway. At that point, if your opponent fails a save, they will probably die. But if the target of the weapon has invulnerable saves, or saving throw improvements like Armor of Contempt, for example, there is a non-zero, in fact, fairly reasonable chance that the Ariok Power Claw inflicts no damage whatsoever. The fact that it's weapon skill 4 on a 3,500 point model is absolutely ludicrous. Now, it does have a sweet profile if you want to attack more often. This is actually a little bit more interesting. It's 12 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 for a flat 8 damage, much higher volume against lighter targets. If you're attacking things that are probably like T11 or lower, this is a much better swing because you are going to be getting more chances at converting those numbers. But we are also talking about a move 10, fairly ponderous vehicle, and I would not really be too excited about trying to make charge moves with this guy. Now, the Power Claw does have a ranged profile. Interestingly, it has a longer base range than some of its actual guns that shoot real bullets, but I think that it's just zapping you with lightning bolts from the Power Fist itself. It is kind of a Tesla-style profile. Strength 6, AP 1 for 2 damage. 20 shots at sustained 1, which is pretty cool and interesting. Good for sweeping infantry, and a nice little bonus for taking the melee attack. But it pales in the comparison to the Warlord Titan's ranged weapons, which is what is going to be the focus here. Now, if it doesn't take that melee weapon, it still has a melee attack profile. Its Warlord feet have 6 base attacks, hitting on 4s at strength 12, AP 2 for a flat 4 damage. Now, more interestingly, let's discuss those ranged weapon profiles. First off, we have 2 weapons that are fairly well-rounded. The first one being the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator. This is a 2d6+6 blast weapon. It can supercharge itself for bonus strength and damage, gaining the hazardous keyword, which is a crippling downside for the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator. On a 1 in 6 chance, you could suffer 3% of your total health in mortal wounds on the Warlord Titan, meaning that there's basically no reason to ever not supercharge this plasma gun, unless it literally doesn't matter based on the target you're attacking. If at any point that extra strength or damage will matter, you just throw on the overheat there. This thing is not really going to suffer too much if you fail that hazardous check. In addition, it also can mount the Morai Quake Cannon. This is a 3D 6-shot blast weapons with one of the longest ranges in the entire game, 280 inches, almost 24 feet of range. But this fires 3d6, strength 16, AP 4, 6 flat damage attacks with ignore cover. This is the exciting part to me because, as we mentioned before, most of the time in 10th edition, you're shooting at enemies, they're benefiting from cover. The Morai Quake Cannon being both AP 4 and ignore cover makes it kind of, almost, if you squint, AP 5, and punches through even the toughest shells of armored vehicles, making it very well-rounded. On top of that, we can also have a dedicated infantry sweeper, the Macro Gatling Blaster. This is a sustained 1-shot weapon firing at 100 inches of range for a staggering 30 attacks at strength 9, AP 2, for a flat 3 damage. Interestingly, you look at this weapon profile and you see that Gatling Blaster, and your mind harkens back to a lot of weapons like Avenger Gatling Cannons, for example, that come in at that high strength, decent AP, high volume, but at 2 damage. This thing fires 3 damage rounds. That means it is a Terminator killer. This guy will just dive into those heavy infantry profiles and absolutely vaporize them. Now, if you really want to vaporize a single guy super hard, the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon is the one for you. This is its dedicated anti-tank blaster. It is another blast weapon firing D3 plus 3 shots at a ridiculously high strength 32, meaning it is wounding other Warlord Titans on 2s. The only reason that strength 32 matters. At AP 5 for a flat, wait for it, 18 damage. That's a lot of damage. Now, in order to compare these weapons, what I'm going to be doing is mathing them out against a variety of standard defensive profiles in Warhammer 40k. This includes the classics: Guard equivalent, toughness 3, 1 wound enemies with a 5+ save; Marine equivalent, that is toughness 4 with a 3+ save and 2 wounds. Terminator equivalents, 2+ save enemies with a 4+ invulnerable save and 3 wounds. All of these infantry profiles, I'm going to assume that the blast weapons have some amount of blast that they are generating. The guard equivalent, I think you're going to get somewhere around +2 for having 10 or more models in the unit. Obviously, when you're playing almost 4,000 point games in 40k, there is a pretty solid chance that you have more than 15 models in a unit, so you could get higher value out of those blast weapons. We're just going to assume +2 for right now. And the Marine equivalent and Terminator equivalent profiles, I'm going to assume you're firing at +1. Now, as I mentioned before, I am going to assume that all of these targets are in cover all the time. They're all going to be towing their pinky toe behind a little wall, or they're inside a ruin, or they're behind a piece of ruined terrain, or they thought about being inside a building one time in their childhood and thus are protected from predations of the Warlord Titan. Now, moving on to vehicles, we are going to be looking at damage against vehicle profiles, whereas the infantry are going to look at average numbers of kills. In this case, we're looking at a light vehicle equivalent, toughness 9 with a 3+ save, and a heavy vehicle or a land raider equivalent at toughness 12 with a 2+ save. Now with that, let's move on and talk about the numbers. Against guard equivalents, we are looking at some incredible damage from the macro Gatling cannon, averaging around 17 kills. However, the other weapons fall down short, including the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator and the Morai Quake Cannon, each averaging 8 and 7 wounds respectively. The Bellicosa Volcano Cannon at that low attack volume only killing 4. If you're looking to sweep infantry, the Macro Gatling Cannon is definitely here for you. And as we can see, already, even with high strength AP and damage values, the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator and Morai Quake Cannon are both looking pretty good even into infantry targets. Moving over to Marine equivalents, assuming you are getting +1 for blast here, the Macro Gatling Cannon still comes out on top, as we could expect from a high volume, medium damage weapon. The downside, of course, is that higher save characteristic essentially cuts damage from this thing in half. But if we look at weapons like the Morai Quake Cannon and the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon, those having either ignore cover or a super high base AP value, do not care about the improved save characteristic of their targets whatsoever. In fact, the only thing giving these a lower average kill rate than the other weapons is the fact that they will probably get less opportunity to get extra attacks from blast. The Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator comes in at an okay value of 5 dead Space Marines on average. Morai Quake Cannon comes in at 6.4, and the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon at 3.3. Now moving over to Terminators, the Warlord Titan is fairly good at killing Terminators. It has multiple huge damage blast weapons, as well as that Macro Gatling Cannon, and the Macro Gatling Cannon comes out on top again, although with that higher base save on Terminators, even compared to Marine equivalents, these guys do significantly less damage, only between 5 and 6 kills for that Gatling Cannon. The Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator getting 3.9, the Morai Quake Cannon coming in at 3.2. That's really being cut down by the improved invulnerable save of the target. So the Plasma Annihilator with its high base volume is still going to be winning on 2s and putting the target on that invuln save. Quake Cannon doesn't really get the benefit of its ignore cover, so it is a little sad in this case. And the same goes for the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon, which only averages between 1 and 2 dead Terminators on average. However, the same cannot be said for vehicle equivalents. Let's move on to talking about average damage against these vehicle profiles. We're not talking about kills, we are talking about damage inflicted. And in this case, as I think we could see coming, the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon comes out ahead starkly. This thing averages a ridiculous, insane, mind-boggling 50 damage against a standard 3+ save vehicle. This thing is wounding everything in the game that doesn't have a wound modifier on it on 2s regardless, so it doesn't really matter what your toughness is. But if you are only a 3+ save and it's punching all the way through that save and cover, you're averaging somewhere around 50 damage. This is followed up by the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator. That high base volume, 2d6 plus 6 on the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator, gives it the edge over many other weapon systems against these lighter vehicles. Once toughness values start to increase, the Sun Fury falls down pretty hard. However, against these light vehicles, this thing does average 30 damage with those big 8 damage conversions. Now, given the fact that we are mathing against a toughness 9 enemy, the Macro Gatling Cannon is actually pretty good here. It still shoots for 19 damage, and the Morai Quake Cannon is very similar to the Sun Fury. It has less attacks at less average damage, but is much better at punching through armor saves. A 3+ save enemy in cover gets no benefit from their armor save whatsoever, so every converted wound roll is damage on the target. That averages them 28, just under the Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator. Now moving on to heavier vehicles, and this is, in my opinion, a much more interesting category because we do see a little bit of striation between these different profiles. This puts the Macro Gatling, now wounding on 5s, into a strong armor save down to only 8 average damage. And a similar thing happens to the Sun Fury. Once the Sun Fury starts wounding on 4s, because it's firing at a T12 enemy, and also has a tough time punching through the save characteristic of a 2+ save enemy in cover, which is an interesting place for Plasma to be, by the way. Plasma tends to be extremely high AP, especially when supercharged, but the Sun Fury Plasma just forgot how to do that. I guess it's kind of not very consistent with the mechanical identity of plasma weapons in 40k, but that's okay. We can forgive it just this once. It is on a Warlord Titan. This gives it an average of only 17 damage. However, the Morai Quake Cannon with that higher AP and higher strength and ignore cover comes in at a big 23. The Bellicosa Volcano Cannon beats them all out, however, as is to be expected. 42 damage. We do end up bumping into a 6+ armor save here, which is why we see it do slightly less damage than it would against a smaller vehicle with a worse armor saving throw. However, that's probably more than enough to kill almost anything you're shooting at. Now, the one thing that it might not be good enough at killing is our last category for today. This is another Warlord Titan. What happens when these two Titans shoot at each other? And looking at this, interestingly, the Macro Gatling Cannon actually doesn't really care about a lot of the defensive profiles that the other Warlord Titan has. It having a high volume of 3 damage attacks, as long as it gets a good enough AP to punch through that Titan's armor save, will actually average quite a bit. And now in this situation, the Macro Gatling's statistics are actually unchanged between firing at a Land Raider and firing at a Warlord Titan. It's wounding on 5s, putting an enemy on a probably 3+ save if they're benefiting from cover, so you're going to be averaging somewhere around 8 damage. That is the same and also the worst performing weapon on the charts, which is not that surprising given that it is an infantry sweeper. The Sun Fury Plasma Annihilator starts to show its downside with its lack of high strength. It starts to wound on 5s, and that gives it a big problem. That means it puts it down to an average of only around 11 damage. The Morai Quake Cannon, on the other hand, does have that high strength characteristic of 16, so it is wounding on 4s. However, the target's invulnerable save actually comes into play here. So it does significantly less damage than it would against a lower toughness, uninvulnerable saved enemy, only averaging 14. The Bellicosa Volcano Cannon, however, only sees a little bit of a downside inefficiency thanks to that ion field invulnerable save, putting it down to 33 average damage. So that begs us the question, what is the correct loadout for your Warlord Titan? Now, all of these different ARM weapon systems are effective in different situations. The Sun Fury Plasma is good in situations against medium save enemies that have a lower toughness value. However, that is a very narrow use case. That's the one weapon, maybe alongside the Power Claw, that is, to be fair, kind of a meme that I wouldn't really consider taking here. The other interesting inclusion is the Morai Quake Cannon. If you're not sure what your preferred target's going to be, I think the Quake Cannon is the weapon for you. This has a smooth damage profile against basically everything. It's fine against infantry, especially non-invulnerable save protected infantry. In that case, it's actually really good. And it is good into most vehicles. It's just not a Titan killer like the Volcano Cannon is. If you need to kill infantry, the Gatling Cannon is for you. And if you need to kill vehicles, the Bellicosa Volcano Cannon is for you. So those are much more dedicated weapon profiles. Now, exactly how much damage can we expect from these once they are attributed to a full loadout? We're going to be looking at an anti-tank loadout that features those volcano cannons versus an anti-infantry loadout that features those macro gatlings in their ideal situation, firing at their ideal equivalent target. On top of that, let's also talk about the other weapon systems on the Warlord. Now, I did mention all of these before, but what I will do here is include the defensive and carapace mounted systems on the Warlord Titan, and we can discuss their weapon profiles now as well. This includes the 2 Ardex Defensor las cannons, just regular las cannons. We could have kept the Ardex Defensor out of it. It makes it feel like it should have a special ability, but it doesn't. It's okay. That's neither here nor there. I'm not going to go on a tangent about the weird wordings on this data sheet. This also includes its pair of Ardex Defensor Maulers, as well as the carapace weapons, either its Apocalypse Launcher or its Laser Blast. Now, I mentioned before how well designed the Warlord Titan is, with no flaws whatsoever. Everything is perfect, and this data sheet certainly reflects the immense amounts of physical money, as well as virtual Warhammer points that you spend on including this thing in your army, because both of its carapace weapons have the blast keyword. despite idiosyncratically not having a random number of attacks. This is sort of a bizarre part of the core 40k rules that states that blast weapons always make a random number of attacks and only add attacks to their attack pool when you determine the random number of attacks that you make with that weapon. So for whatever reason, adding blast to a non-random weapon, as far as I know, only prevents it from firing it into engagement range, which I guess is fair, but it feels like the idea is for them to gain bonus attacks against larger units, and they just don't do that, which might be an oversight. I don't know. Now, the weapon profiles it's attaching to are either that laser blaster. This is the anti-tank specialist of the top of the Warlord, firing 6 shots out to 72 inches at strength 16 AP4 for D6 plus 3 damage. Basically, 6 super powerful las cannons or even laser destroyers all stapled together. On the flip side is the Apocalypse Launcher. This is an anti-infantry powerhouse, especially medium infantry. It fires 20 shots out to a ridiculous 200-inch range at strength 8 AP2 for 2 damage. Now, here is the kicker for the Apocalypse Launcher. And regardless of what I talk about later with mathing their specific weapon profiles out against their preferred targets, the Apocalypse Launcher should always be in the back of your mind when you are equipping the Warlord Titan that you definitely own, because it has indirect fire. And while in Apocalypse, oftentimes things do not have enough terrain to hide, this has enough attacks that it is probably able to punch out infantry units or utility units from behind cover, even with all of the modern indirect fire hit penalties. It's hitting on 4's base, your target's always in cover, and you get -1 to hit if for some reason that also mattered. But this gives the Warlord Titan utility in every situation, even when your opponent is hiding from its towering fury, as they most intelligently should. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about a Warlord Titan kitted to shoot vehicles and also shooting at vehicles. So this includes 2 Bellicosa Volcano Cannons. We have to remember that all of the numbers I just gave you are for a single weapon. The Warlord Titan gets 2 of each. So we have 2 Volcano Cannons, 2 Defensor Las Cannons, 2 Ardex Maulers, and 2 Laser Blasters. Against a Land Raider equivalent T12 2+ save enemy in cover, you are averaging a massive, staggering 1 damage from its Defensor Maulers, as well as 1.5 damage from its 2 regular las cannons. However, its laser blasters are averaging 23 damage, and its 2 volcano cannons give you somewhere in the realm of 84 damage. All told, this gives you somewhere in the ballpark of 108 expected damage against a Land Raider equivalent target, meaning that this thing kills the equivalent of 6.75 Land Raiders with its combined firepower every time it shoots. If we're assuming that these are the slightly more expensive pattern of Land Raider, at least at the time of recording, the Land Raider Redeemer at 285 points a pop, this means that the Warlord Titan inflicts the equivalent of 1,923 3/4 points worth of damage every time it fires, over half of its own value with its attacks. Now, to be fair, most of the things that it's shooting at are just going to die. So it's actually very difficult for it to find 6.75 specific Land Raiders to destroy at once. Most often you will fire 1 volcano cannon at each Land Raider and maybe the laser blasters at another Land Raider, or maybe 2 Land Raiders and hope for the best. And you'll average killing probably 3 to 4. And the volcano cannons end up doing a lot of spillover damage, averaging 2 to 3 dead Land Raiders every time they attack. Now let's contrast that with the anti-infantry loadout, firing at toughness 3 light infantry. This includes 2 Apocalypse launchers mounted on the carapace, its Defensor las cannons, its Defensor maulers, as well as 2 macro Gatling cannons. And this gives us an average of 1 kill with its 2 las cannons, 6 kills with its 2 Defensor maulers, 19 kills with its combined 40 attacks from its Apocalypse launchers, and, not to be outdone, 35 dead guardsmen with its 2 macro Gatling cannons. That is a total of 60 attack with sustained hits 1, meaning that the vast majority of your shots will convert into successful hits, and a lot of those will end up killing targets. This gives you an average kill count on guard equivalent enemies of 61 enemies. Now, the real challenge is finding enough guard equivalent enemies in large enough units that you don't dramatically overkill them, but it is, in fairness, a lot easier to do that against infantry than it is against vehicles. Infantry tend to have a lot more stuff to spill over on than a single Land Raider that gets wildly overkilled by a Bellicosa volcano cannon. The fact that you are also using Apocalypse launchers to add additional damage on top of that indirectly means that this thing can be contributing to the fight over the course of the game, regardless of whether or not it can actually see the correct targets for its weapons. It will do slightly less damage than that average of 19 in most instances if it's firing indirectly. However, you could still probably kill a squad full of models with those Apocalypse launchers firing at enemies that are trying to hunker down. So what is the correct loadout for your Warlord Titan? In my opinion, I think a combination of the Bellicosa volcano cannons and Apocalypse launchers might be the way to go. You could also switch the script and give it its laser blasters and macro gatlings, depending on whether you want to specialize harder into destroying infantry or tanks. If you really want to kill other Warlord Titans, laser blasters and volcano cannons are the way to go. And if you're not sure, and you're more expecting to see a variety of targets, those Moroi Quake Cannons are literally always good. There's basically no situation in which they are firing at a target and they have a bad profile. I guess like a Demon that only has an invuln save and doesn't care about ignore cover might not care about this thing, but basically every other instance, it's very good. But let me know down in the comment section whether or not you agree with my take, what the name of the Warlord Titan that you definitely own and definitely plan to play in the future is, and if you found this video incredibly useful for your journey through highly competitive Warhammer 40,000. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.